The autumn rain hammered against the grimy windows of the small two-bedroom home at 14 Lodge Road in Aston, Birmingham, as young John Michael Osbourne sat huddled in the corner of the cramped living room he shared with his 5 siblings. It was October 1957, and the boy who would one day become the legendary Ozzy Osbourne was just 9 years old, struggling with undiagnosed dyslexia and already feeling like an outcast in a world that seemed too harsh and complicated for him to understand. His mother, Lillian, a non-practicing Catholic who worked tirelessly at a factory to help support their working-class family, had noticed something special about her 4th child. When John sang, usually when he thought no one was listening, his voice carried a haunting quality that seemed far too powerful for such a small, shy boy. She would hear him humming melodies he'd picked up from the radio, transforming them into something uniquely his own, his voice trembling with an emotion he couldn't yet name. That particular rainy afternoon, Mrs. Henderson, the stern but kind music director from St. Philip's Anglican Church down the street, sat in the Osbournes' modest living room, sipping weak tea from a chipped cup. She had come with a proposition that would terrify young John and unknowingly set in motion events that would one day change the face of music forever. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like. Your support helps us share more inspiring stories about the legends who shaped our world. Mrs. Osbourne, Mrs. Henderson began, her proper accent cutting through the sound of rain. We're having a special service this Sunday for the church's anniversary. I've heard your John has quite the voice, and I wondered if he might be willing to sing for us. Just one hymn, Amazing Grace. It would mean so much to the congregation. John felt his stomach drop. His cheeks flushed crimson, and he tried to make himself even smaller in his corner. Sing? In front of people? The very thought made him want to disappear into the worn floorboards beneath his feet. "Oh, I don't know," Lillian said carefully, glancing at her son's terrified face. "John's a bit shy, you see. He struggles at school with the reading and all. I'm not sure he'd be comfortable." "Please, Mrs. Osbourne," Mrs. Henderson interrupted gently. "The boy has a gift. I've heard him singing when he walks past the church. God doesn't give us talents to hide them under a bushel. Sometimes we just need a little push to discover what we're truly capable of." What happened next would haunt and inspire Ozzy Osbourne for the rest of his life. His father, Jack Osbourne, a toolmaker who worked brutal hours to keep food on the table, looked up from his newspaper. "The boy will do it," he said firmly. "It'll be good for him. Build some character." John wanted to protest, to run, to simply vanish. But in 1957, Birmingham, children didn't argue with their fathers. He nodded mutely, his whole body beginning to shake with anxiety. The days leading up to that Sunday were torture for young John. He couldn't eat properly, couldn't sleep. His older sisters, Jean, Iris, and Gillian, tried to encourage him, teaching him the words to Amazing Grace over and over again. His younger brothers, Paul and Tony, watched with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity as their brother transformed into a bundle of nerves. Mrs. Henderson visited twice more that week to practice with him. She noticed that John couldn't read the hymn sheet properly. The letters seemed to dance and rearrange themselves before his eyes, a symptom of the dyslexia that wouldn't be diagnosed for years. Instead, she sang each line, and John repeated it back to her, his remarkable memory capturing every note, every inflection. "You have something special, child," she told him during their final practice. "Your voice, it's raw and untrained, but there's power in it. Real power. Don't be afraid of it." But John was afraid. Terrified, actually. Sunday morning arrived with grey skies and a bitter wind that cut through the thin walls of the Osbourne home. Lillian had laid out John's best clothes, a shirt that was slightly too small, passed down from one of his older siblings, and trousers that had been carefully mended at the knees. But there was a problem that would become part of rock and roll legend, though no one knew it then. John's only pair of decent shoes had finally given up the ghost. The sole had separated completely from the left shoe just 2 days earlier, and there was no money to replace them. His father had tried to repair them with glue and hope, but they'd fallen apart again that very morning. "Mum, I can't go," John pleaded, his voice cracking. "I haven't got proper shoes. Everyone will laugh at me." Lillian Osbourne knelt down in front of her son, her work-worn hands gentle on his shoulders. "Listen to me, John Michael. Those people in that church, they're not going to be looking at your feet. They're going to be listening to your voice. And your voice, my darling boy, is beautiful. You go in there with your head held high. Shoes don't make the man or the boy. Your heart does. And so it was that 9-year-old John Osbourne walked the 3 blocks to St. Philip's Anglican Church on that cold October morning in his clean but ill-fitting clothes and completely barefoot, his feet already turning red from the cold pavement. The church was modest by any standard, a stone building that had stood in that Birmingham neighbourhood since the 1800s. It smelled of old wood, candle wax, and the particular mustiness that seemed to inhabit all churches of that era. The pews were filling up with the Sunday congregation, working-class families like the Osbournes, elderly widows in their best hats, a few young couples with small children. John slipped into a pew next to his mother, trying to make himself invisible. He tucked his bare feet under the seat, hoping no one would notice. His whole body was shaking now, partly from cold, but mostly from pure, unadulterated terror. He had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable, more certain that he was about to humiliate himself and his family in the worst possible way. The service proceeded with excruciating slowness. Hymns were sung, prayers were recited, scripture was read. John heard none of it. His heart was pounding so loudly in his ears that it drowned out everything else. His hands were clammy, his mouth dry as cotton. He kept thinking about running, just bolting out the door and never coming back. Then, Mrs. Henderson was standing at the pulpit, smiling warmly at the congregation. Before Reverend Thomas delivers his sermon, we have a very special treat this morning. Young John Osbourne has graciously agreed to sing for us. John, would you come forward, please? The walk from his pew to the front of that church felt like walking to the gallows. John's bare feet made soft padding sounds on the cold stone floor, sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the hushed church. He could feel every eye on him, could hear the whispers starting. Is that boy barefoot? Poor thing hasn't got shoes. Shame, really, in this day and age. John's face burned with humiliation. When he reached the front of the church and turned to face the congregation, he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. His legs were shaking so badly, he could barely stand. His hands trembled at his sides. He looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some sympathetic, some judgmental, and felt tears beginning to prick at his eyes. This was it. This was the moment he would fail, would prove to everyone that he was just a poor, shoeless boy from Aston who couldn't even read properly, let alone sing in front of people. Mrs. Henderson sat at the old upright piano and played the opening notes of Amazing Grace. The familiar melody floated through the church, and for a moment, John's mind went completely blank. He couldn't remember a single word, not one. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence stretched on, terrible and damning. People began to shift uncomfortably in their pews. John could see his mother's face, full of love and encouragement, trying to will him to succeed. Then, something extraordinary happened. In that moment of absolute terror and vulnerability, standing barefoot and shaking before a congregation of strangers, John Michael Osbourne closed his eyes. He blocked out the judgmental stares, the whispers about his bare feet, the fear of failure that threatened to crush him. He thought about his mother's words, "Your voice is beautiful," and he sang, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." The voice that emerged from that small, trembling 9-year-old boy was nothing short of miraculous. It wasn't polished or trained, it was raw, emotional, and filled with a power that seemed impossible from such a source. The words poured out of him, not because he was reading them, he couldn't have read them even if he'd wanted to, but because he felt them. That saved a wretch like me. Every ounce of shame he felt about his bare feet, every moment of being bullied at school for his dyslexia, every time he'd felt small and worthless and different, all of it poured into that song. His voice cracked with emotion, wavered with vulnerability, but never wavered in its honesty. I once was lost, but now am found. The congregation, who moments before had been whispering about the barefoot boy, fell into stunned silence. Hardened factory workers felt unexpected tears in their eyes. Elderly women who had heard Amazing Grace thousands of times heard it as if for the first time. Even Reverend Thomas, who had planned to gently redirect the service after what he assumed would be a child's awkward attempt at singing, found himself transfixed, was blind. But now I see, this wasn't just a boy singing a hymn. This was something else entirely. This was a soul crying out, finding its voice, discovering in that moment of terror and vulnerability that it had something powerful to say to the world. When the last note faded away, there was a moment of absolute silence in St. Philip's Church. John opened his eyes, certain he had failed, ready for the mocking laughter to begin. Instead, the church erupted in applause. It started with his mother, tears streaming down her face, clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. Then the woman next to her joined in, and then the row behind them, and within seconds, the entire congregation was on their feet, applauding a barefoot 9-year-old boy who had just discovered he had a gift. Mrs. Henderson rushed over and hugged him, something that wasn't really done in proper 1957 Britain, but she didn't care. "I told you," she whispered in his ear. "I told you that you had something special." John was overwhelmed, unable to process what had just happened. People came up to him after the service, shaking his hand, patting his shoulder, telling him how beautiful his voice was. Not one person mentioned his bare feet. They had listened with their hearts, just as his mother had said they would. His father, not a man given to displays of emotion, put his hand on John's shoulder as they walked home. "You did good, son," was all he said, but it was enough. That night, lying in bed in the room he shared with his brothers, John replayed the experience over and over in his mind. He had been terrified. He had been vulnerable. He had stood before people wearing his poverty literally on his bare feet. And he had triumphed. Not because he had hidden his shame or pretended to be something he wasn't, but because he had been completely, authentically himself. It was a lesson that would stay with John Michael Osbourne for the rest of his life. Years later, when he became Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, the voice of Black Sabbath, a solo artist who would sell millions of albums and influence generations of musicians, he would remember that barefoot 9-year-old boy shaking in a Birmingham church. He would remember that the moments of greatest vulnerability could become moments of greatest power. That authenticity, real, raw, unvarnished truth, connected with people in ways that polished perfection never could. That it was okay to be scared, to shake, to feel like an outsider, because those feelings could be transformed into something beautiful. The experience in St. Philip's Church didn't immediately transform John into a confident performer. He remained a shy, struggling student who felt out of place in most situations. But something had awakened in him that October morning, a seed that would grow slowly but surely over the years. He began attending Sunday school more regularly at the Anglican Church, not because he was particularly religious, but because it was one of the few places where he felt accepted. He would spend hours there drinking tea, listening to Bible stories, and drawing pictures of baby Jesus, beginning to define the creative persona that would later shock the world. Mrs. Henderson tried to convince him to join the church choir, but the idea of regular performances still terrified him. He would sing occasionally at church services over the next few years, always nervous, always feeling like that barefoot 9-year-old, but each time finding a little more confidence, a little more connection to the power of his own voice. When he was 14, everything changed again. He heard the Beatles' "She Loves You" for the first time, and as he would later say in the 2011 documentary, God Bless Ozzy Osbourne, he realized that he was going to be a rock star the rest of his life. But even as he dreamed of musical stardom, life remained hard. He struggled through school, dealt with severe bullying, and at age 11 suffered sexual abuse from school bullies that left deep psychological scars. The shy, sensitive boy who had once sung "Amazing Grace" barefoot in a church found darker ways to cope with his pain. He attempted suicide multiple times as a teenager, feeling lost and hopeless in a world that seemed to have no place for someone like him. The voice that had once lifted up a congregation now screamed silently with anguish. At 15, he dropped out of school and took a series of soul-crushing working-class jobs: plumber's apprentice, slaughterhouse worker, car horn tester. He was arrested for burglary and spent 6 weeks in prison. His father refused to pay his 40-ton fine, teaching him a harsh but valuable lesson about consequences. These were dark years. Years when it seemed like the promise of that October morning in 1957 had been nothing but a cruel illusion. The boy who had discovered his voice seemed to have lost it again in the grinding poverty and hopelessness of working-class Birmingham. But voices like John Osbourne's don't stay silent forever. In 1968, 20 years after his birth and 11 years after that fateful morning at St. Philip's Church, John joined forces with guitarist Tony Iommi, bassist Geezer Butler, and drummer Bill Ward to form a band called Earth. They played blues rock initially, struggling to find their sound, struggling to be heard in a music scene dominated by flower power and hippie optimism. Then they discovered something. They realized that while other bands were singing about love and peace, they could sing about the darkness they'd experienced, the fear and pain and struggle that working-class kids like them knew intimately. They could take the raw, emotional honesty that 9-year-old John had accidentally discovered singing Amazing Grace and channel it into something entirely new. They renamed themselves Black Sabbath after a Boris Karloff horror film and created music that was heavier, darker, and more emotionally honest than anything that had come before. And at the center of it all was John Michael Osbourne's voice, now going by the nickname Ozzy that had stuck since primary school. Still raw, still powerful, still shaking with the same vulnerability he'd felt as a barefoot child in a Birmingham church. The first time Ozzy performed War Pigs with Black Sabbath, standing on stage in front of a crowd, he thought about that morning at St. Philip's. The terror was still there. It never really went away. But so was the knowledge that vulnerability could be power, that authenticity could move people, that his voice, imperfect and raw as it was, had something important to say. Black Sabbath's music was immediately controversial. They were accused of Satanism, of promoting evil, of corrupting youth. But Ozzy, remembering his Sunday school days, remembering singing Amazing Grace, knew the truth. Songs like After Forever explicitly questioned atheism and affirmed belief in God. Do you think that when you die, you'll just stay in your grave? I believe that it's true that it was people like you who crucified Christ. The irony was rich. The boy who had sung in an Anglican church, who had been christened as a Christian, who attended Sunday school, was now being called the Prince of Darkness. But Ozzy understood something his critics didn't. Darkness and light weren't opposites. They were partners in revealing truth. You couldn't appreciate Amazing Grace without understanding what it meant to be lost. Years passed. Black Sabbath became legends. Ozzy's solo career reached even greater heights. He became famous not just for his music, but for his outrageous behavior. Biting the head off a bat, he thought it was rubber. Urinating on the Alamo, the constant battles with addiction. But through it all, Ozzy never forgot where his voice had come from. He told the New York Times in 1992 that he was a practicing member of the Church of England and that he prayed before every performance. The 2011 documentary God Bless Ozzy Osbourne, produced by his son Jack, ended with footage of Ozzy alone, locking himself in a dressing room to kneel and pray before a show. He wasn't the same 9-year-old boy who had sung Barefoot in a church, and yet he was. The terror before performing never completely went away. The feeling of being an outsider, of being different, of being judged, those stayed with him. But so did the knowledge that his voice, his authentic, vulnerable, imperfect voice, had power. When he married Sharon Arden in 1982, when they had children together, Amy, Kelly, and Jack, he tried to give them the confidence he'd never had as a child. But he also taught them the value of vulnerability, of not being afraid to show fear, to admit struggle, to be real. The Osbournes' MTV reality show, which ran from 2002 to 2005, showed the world a side of Ozzy that shocked many fans. Here was the Prince of Darkness, bumbling around his house, struggling with everyday tasks, being completely, authentically himself. Flawed, vulnerable, often confused, but always real. It was the most watched show on cable television because people connected with that authenticity. Just as a Birmingham congregation had connected with a barefoot 9-year-old's vulnerable rendition of Amazing Grace. As Ozzy aged and battled health issues, spinal injuries, Parkinson's disease, the accumulated damage from decades of substance abuse, he often thought about that October morning in 1957. In interviews, He would occasionally mention his childhood experiences in church, though he rarely went into detail about that first performance. But those who knew him well, Sharon, his children, his closest friends and collaborators, understood that everything Ozzy had become as an artist traced back to that moment when a terrified, barefoot child had stood in front of a congregation and discovered that his greatest vulnerability could become his greatest strength. On July 5, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne performed his final concert at Villa Park in Birmingham, the Back to the Beginning show that reunited the original Black Sabbath lineup. Suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease, unable to stand, Ozzy sat on a black throne and sang for 40,000 fans and millions watching via live stream. His voice was weaker than it had been in his prime, roughened by age and illness. His hands shook, not from nervousness this time, but from the disease that was slowly stealing his body's ability to function. But as he sang War Pigs, NIB, Iron Man, and Paranoid, something magical happened. The crowd didn't hear an old man struggling with illness. They heard authenticity. They heard vulnerability transformed into power. They heard a voice that had spent nearly 7 decades refusing to hide its imperfections, insisting on being real, on being honest, on connecting with people through shared pain and shared triumph. Watching from the wings, Sharon Osbourne, who had been by his side for over 4 decades, who had managed his career, saved his life multiple times, and loved him through all his chaos, saw something that brought tears to her eyes. For just a moment, singing there on his throne, unable to move but still able to give his voice to the world, Ozzy was that 9-year-old boy again. Scared, vulnerable, imperfect, barefoot in spirit if not in fact, and absolutely, undeniably powerful. 17 days later, on July 22, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne died at his home in Buckinghamshire, England, surrounded by his family. His death certificate would list acute myocardial infarction, heart attack, and out-of-hospital cardiac arrest as the primary causes, with coronary artery disease and Parkinson's disease, with autonomic dysfunction as contributing factors. When Sharon and the children gathered to plan the funeral, they talked about how to honor Ozzy's memory. There would be a public procession through Birmingham, of course, past the Black Sabbath Bridge, past the landmarks of his childhood. Thousands would line the streets to say goodbye. But Sharon insisted on one more thing. She contacted Mrs. Henderson's great-niece, who still lived in Birmingham, and attended the church that had once been St. Philip's. It had merged with another parish decades earlier, but still stood. She asked if it would be possible to hold a small private memorial service there. On a quiet morning before the public funeral, the Osbourne family gathered in that same stone church, where 9-year-old John had once sung Amazing Grace. The building had been renovated over the years, but the bones remained the same cold stone floors, the same high ceiling that carried voices so beautifully. Kelly Osbourne stood at the front of the church, in almost the exact spot where her father had stood 68 years earlier, and though her feet were not bare, she wore elegant heels befitting the occasion. She kicked them off before she began to sing. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. Her voice cracked with emotion, wavered with grief, shook with the same vulnerability her father had felt all those years ago. It wasn't a perfect performance. It wasn't meant to be. It was real and honest and full of love for a man who had taught her that vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Sharon wept quietly in the front pew, remembering the man she'd loved, the chaos and beauty of their life together, the voice that had first captivated her before she'd even met the man it belonged to. Jack closed his eyes, thinking about the documentary he'd made about his father, about all the interviews where people had talked about Ozzy's authenticity, his realness, his refusal to be anything other than exactly who he was. When Kelly finished singing, there was a moment of silence in the church. Then softly, Sharon began to clap. Jack joined her, then Amy, then the few other family members present. It wasn't the thunderous applause that had greeted 9-year-old John Osbourne in 1957, but it carried the same meaning. You did good, you were real, you were loved. Later, at the public funeral procession, tens of thousands lined the streets of Birmingham. The funeral cortege passed Ozzy's childhood home at 14 Lodge Road, past the Black Sabbath bridge where fans had left mountains of flowers and messages, past the Crown where Black Sabbath had played their first concert. The Boston brass band played Paranoid and Iron Man, transforming heavy metal anthems into something both mournful and celebratory. Fans sang along, many weeping, all united in their love for a man whose voice had spoken to their own feelings of being different, of being outsiders, of struggling to find their place in the world. News coverage of Ozzy's death focused on his legendary career, his battles with addiction, his unlikely success as a reality TV star. Tributes poured in from fellow musicians, fans, and cultural commentators. He was lauded as a pioneer of heavy metal, a survivor, a complex figure whose life had been marked by both darkness and surprising grace. But very few people knew about that October morning in 1957, when a barefoot 9-year-old boy had discovered his voice in a small Birmingham church. Fewer still understood how that moment had shaped everything that came after. The willingness to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to stand before the world imperfect and afraid, but still determined to be heard. Ozzy Osbourne's voice had travelled an extraordinary journey from that cold church floor to the biggest stages in the world. It had screamed and soared, whispered and wailed. It had sung about war and peace, darkness and light, madness and love. It had made him famous, made him wealthy, made him legendary. But it had all started with a simple hymn, sung by a terrified child with no shoes, shaking in front of a small congregation in working-class Birmingham. That child had learned something that morning that would define his entire life and career, that the courage to be vulnerable, to be real, to stand before the world exactly as you are, barefoot and shaking and imperfect, that was where true power lived. That was where grace began. Amazing grace, indeed. Thank you for reading this heartfelt story about Ozzy Osbourne's journey from a shy, barefoot boy to a legendary voice in rock and roll. If this story moved you and inspired you, please show your support with a like. Your engagement helps us share more meaningful stories about the moments that shape the legends we love. In remembering Ozzy's vulnerability and authenticity, we honor not just his memory, but the power of being true to ourselves, no matter how scared we might be.